Welcome to another edition of the Southern Report. Thank you very much for joining me and giving me the privilege of your company. I'm going to get straight into it. There's a lot going on, and we are all focusing on what is happening in the Middle East and what is happening with Israel, etc. No better person to talk to than my dear friend John Haller. So I'm going to bring him straight on and we'll get straight into it. John, lovely to see you again. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Hi, Mark. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm just suddenly realizing I wasn't pressing buttons quick enough, so I need to be on that. But there's so much going on. John.
Yeah, where do we start? My head is kind of spinning. Just with as I told you beforehand, I don't know if I'm to take credit for that. I said something to a friend out at the golf club that I work at yesterday, and he said, "Oh, that's really good. I'm going to use that." And I don't know if I originated or not, but I'll take credit for it, and I won't tell you what it is because it's probably not. It's not off color. It's not scandalous or anything. It was just a comment about why neither one of us are a big fan of Florida. But because they seem to have a lot of trouble down in Florida all the time. And we were asking Liz, why do people live there? Well, the golf courses drain very well. That's one thing. And you can have a rainstorm and you can go out and play very quickly after because they just have that sandy soil, much like up in Scotland. But so I had to do a conference about 4 years ago, and I was sort of thinking like, what can I come up with in terms of a grid, sort of look at this crush of everything that we have in terms of news and scripture coming to light and prophecy. What used to be on a slow roll, now it's happening faster and it's all happening at the same time. So I came up with this acceleration, convergence, logistics, and understanding. Daniel 12, the understanding part says at the end of times, people are going to have a better understanding of what's going on. And then there's the logistics. All of these things, we talked with Patrick Wood the other day. Patrick made a brilliant comment about the mark of the beast technology last year in an interview with Tom Hughes. And I quoted a lot because I thought it was absolutely brilliant, which you would expect coming from Patrick Wood.
Absolutely.
But it was, when the abomination of desolation takes place in this coming final period of history before the Lord returns, the Antichrist and false prophet, the abomination of desolation is not going to happen. And then they're going to have a meeting and say, we need to raise some money to roll out the mark of the beast technology and everything. They're just going to flip the switch. They're not going to say we need to crowdsource and fund the development of this system. It's already going to be there in place. So that's part of logistics. And then convergence, everything happening all at once, and then acceleration, everything happening more quickly. And it seems like I talk to people. I just finished a podcast. It's like if you're talking about something 2 weeks ago, it almost seems like ancient history. And sometimes we sit here today and we let's just talk about the last 5 years. No, we don't need to talk about the last 5 years. We just need to talk about the last 2 weeks or the last 24 hours of things that have happened and then things that are coming up. So let's look at Israel. I think you asked me a question about that. I think it's the pivot point of Bible prophecy, certainly biblical history. And I think a lot of scriptures that we've seen, we've kind of read them, and that's nice. It's a good story. Maybe there's some application to us. But I think we're at the point where we're going to start to see these scriptures actually start to come alive in our presence, and right before our eyes. So over the last 24 hours, Israel was attacked by Iran yesterday, about 24 hours ago, in the largest ballistic missile attack in human history. I mean, beyond anything in World War I or World War II or any of the other subsequent wars, There were about 180 ballistic missiles launched into Israel. Israel took out most of them. I think that we don't have the full story as to what exactly was damaged. There's a tremendous amount of propaganda floating around the anti-Israel, Jew-hating channels like Candace Owens and those sorts of people about how bad, Israel was destroyed, their air base was destroyed, their gas platform was destroyed in the Mediterranean. And I've not been able to get that confirmed. There was only one person killed in Israel. It was an Arab man down by Jericho. The Arrow, I'm pretty sure they used the Arrow 3 or Arrow 2 system to take out these ballistic missiles. Iron Dome really doesn't work with regard to these. And the missile was, shot down in the sky, and the falling remnant of the missile, I mean, they don't make the missile disappear, they break it apart. And a big piece of the missile fell. There's actually he was in an area where there's a security camera, which could be just about anybody anywhere on the planet now. It fell on him and killed him, just crushed him. And the video's out there. It's kind of horrifying. But and so all this happened, so Israel shot down most of the missiles. There were a number that landed, but when Israel's only going to get maybe 95% of the missiles. So if there's 180, 200 missiles, that means that, 10 of them are going to get through under the best of circumstances. And then they're going to let some land and blow up because they calculate where those are going to land. And they have algorithms built into their system that immediately, almost instantaneously calculate when the missile is launched, where it's going to land. And is that building, is it an open field? Is it a highway? Is it a highway at rush hour? Is it for example, one missile hit a school. Now, that could have been intentionally left go by Israel because there's nobody at school that time. They're in a holiday season. So they knew the school would be unoccupied, but maybe it was one that got through. We don't know any of this yet, but suffice it to say that the great victory that Iran is claiming is really kind of pathetic in many respects. Other than that man being killed, I'm not aware of any injuries. Israel today is conducting normal military operations, even from the bases that are claimed to have been destroyed. So I think that, but that it's very significant, and last week, Netanyahu stood at the UN podium and talked about, Israel and blessing and curse, which happened to be almost lifted verbatim from the Torah portion for Shabbat last week, which was from Deuteronomy chapter 30 about the blessings and the curses. And you see these prophetic events tied to biblical language all the time. It's pretty stunning.
So where are we at? Because there was that awful incident when there were two terrorists who then shot to death Israelis on a train where there's some children killed as well.
There were, I've heard 6 or 8 people killed. I'm not sure exactly how many that was, but yeah, they took a train. They got off the train near Jaffa, biblical port of Jaffa, and went down the street shooting people. They were taken out, by the way. One of the guys who took them out, in Israeli terms, neutralized them, was a guy who had actually been involved with the organization of the Nova Festival that was attacked by Hamas in Gaza a year ago, just almost exactly a year ago. He was a reservist in the IDF, so he had a weapon on him, and he was kind of interesting video. If you watch it, he's in flip-flops and he's out there tracking these guys down and killing them. So that happened. And then this morning there were 7 or 8 IDF soldiers killed in an ambush up in southern Lebanon. So the war goes on. Israel had that massive series of strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And yesterday in the attack by Iran, I think Iran had planned to do all of this stuff simultaneously to overwhelm the system. So they were going to do the Gaza border, they're going to do the Lebanon border, they're going to do Lebanon Hezbollah rockets, they're going to do ballistic missiles from Iran. And yesterday, it was pretty much ballistic missiles from Iran. Later, there were a few rockets, missiles shot by Hezbollah, but nothing on a coordinated basis like they thought. Last week, when they took out the top leadership of the Hezbollah al-Radwan brigade in Beirut, they were having that meeting in person because Israel had completely degraded and destroyed their confidence in using electronic devices. So they were like, okay, well, we'll get together in person. And Israel had figured out how to track them. When people went to the hospital to get treatment from the pager attack, then they were able to identify, oh, this person is part of Hezbollah because he had a pager. And then they were able to track them to their networks and families and stuff when they went home. And that's how they tracked some of the leadership of the al-Radwan brigade. But the al-Radwan brigade was meeting to finalize plans for an incursion across the northern border into the northern region of Israel and the Galilee region, and an attack very similar to what Hamas did in Gaza just a year ago. So they were putting the finishing touches on that when Israel took out the top command and control structure of that section of Hezbollah, and then they later took out Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah himself. So now the question is, what's Israel going to do to respond? I think you will see a rather large response from Israel against Iran here in the. I don't know when it will happen. I don't have that kind of access, and nobody would tell me anyway, even if they knew. But there were meetings, special council meetings of the Mossad, Shin Bet, military, IDF, and upper political people in a situation room in wherever they meet, Tel Aviv or wherever. Occurred just within the last few hours. So there may be a big response. It also comes at the time of the Jewish high holy days, starting with Rosh Hashanah, which starts, I think, at sundown tonight in Israel. And then that leads up to the period of ending with Yom Kippur in 10 days. And biblically, this period of time is known as the days of awe. So the question will be, are we going to have a biblical, prophetic days of awe in the next 10 days? That could very well be the case.
When you say, excuse my ignorance, when you say a biblical, prophetic days of awe, could you expand on that?
Well, Israel in the different Bible prophecy passages, I would include passages like Isaiah 17, Ezekiel 35 through 39, Jeremiah, other passages in Ezekiel. It identifies Israel's enemies, and it gets a little bit tricky. Are they are they the people group that was described in, say, Ezekiel 38, from the far reaches of the north, Gog, Magog, Meshach, Tubal, Rosh. Some people try to say, well, the Tubal people migrated here, so that's who we should watch at. I just think Ezekiel, he was thinking at it in terms of it's this area of the globe that's going to attack Israel in the latter days. And then we have a question about timing and everything. But we certainly see all of these nations rising up. And if you look at the people groups identified in Psalm 83, you're going to see a lot of them in play right now. Tyre, Sidon, Gebal, Gaza, Edom, which is Jordan, or maybe the Palestinian people. They claim they're Edomites. So all of it's very biblical. And I think we're sort of at this space or place, Mark, where we don't know exactly how it's going to unfold. Look, people write books about how it's going to unfold, and then they become, I think, a little bit too dogmatic. It has to happen the way that I wrote. And they may turn out to be right. I just don't think we're at that stage where we can say this is that which was prophesied. But I think we can say it's certainly starting to look a lot like this is that which was prophesied by the prophets. And these scriptures are really going to come alive. And if we are at the time when I think we are, it's only going to accelerate. It's only going to converge. And I think as it happens, we'll have understanding. So that's kind of where I am. So you see clearly one nation that's unmistakably against Israel in the end times is Persia. Another one would be Turkey. All of those are coming together against Israel. There's also mention in Ezekiel or Psalm 83 about Assyria, region of Syria, which is modern day Iraq. So when you look at the fronts that Israel's facing right now, Israel's facing a war on 7, 8, or 9 fronts. So you have Gaza, you have Lebanon, you have Syria, a lot of Hezbollah brigades in Syria. You have the area that the world calls the West Bank, which is really Judea and Samaria, biblical Judea and Samaria, actually the biblical heartland. Then you have Iraq, Iran, Yemen, and then I think you have the 8th or 9th front would be the media and would be one, and then religious war against Israel. So it seems to all be coming together. I don't know how quickly or anything like that. It may take beyond my, I'm getting older, so my lifetime is increasingly obviously limited. So I don't know. It's funny. Mike Spalding. Mike and I, we did a conference this past weekend in Dayton. And Mike said to me, and every time I go to a conference, one of the other speakers or all of the other speakers will say something like this to me, and I'll say it to them. I can't believe I'm seeing all of these things happening all at the same time. And that's just on the Israel geopolitical front, let alone some of the other stuff we'll talk about, the globalist agendas and Mark of the Beast technology and all this stuff. It's all, as I said, converging at a very rapid rate.
And I can imagine Mike saying that, as I can imagine many of us saying that, and I appreciate his honesty, because I think there's that point where we're around people, we're going to conferences, we've got friends, and we're looking at biblical prophecy, we're looking at what we think is happening, we're interpreting scripture, interpreting in events, and then why are we surprised that we're in the middle of it and things are unfolding? There is that sort of dichotomy to me, John, because we are it is unfolding. We're not date setting, but we're looking at events, we've got scripture on our hand, and it's moving forward.
So, the Israel thing, though, is a very, very big deal. People need to pay attention to that. And listen, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that what's unfolding in the Middle East is going to blossom into a third world war. That's certainly a very distinct possibility, given the way things are unfolding and the speed at which they're coming together.
Well, and then Russia, Ukraine, the way that has divided opinion. We go through history of that, etc. And even our recent Prime Minister Boris Johnson getting on a plane and going over, and it seems as though it's like Zelensky, don't talk to Putin, don't negotiate here. You are right. It looks as though we could be on the edge of this.
Look, by the way, it has a practical effect. So, Bill Koenig, I think, and Bill and I have been friends for over 20 years now.
I know of him, and I know his work.
Okay, so he wrote a book called Eye to Eye, Facing the Consequences of Dividing Israel, and tracks how when the U.S. or other governments talk about dividing the land of Israel, things don't go so well. So, for example, Trump came out with a plan in January of 2020 and it included a Palestinian state dividing the land of Israel. Yeah. Now, listen, the motives are good. People want peace. They don't want war. They want to figure out a way for people to live in peace. But God has some very specific guidelines about that. So that was in the morning in January of 2020. That afternoon, literally, I don't know how else to say it, all hell broke loose on the Charlie Vector 019er situation. And look what happened. So last Thursday, we're getting ready to go pick up Patrick and his wife. They stayed with us at the house at the airport. And Pam says to me, John, have you seen how that storm intensified? So I texted with Bill shortly thereafter and sort of unpacked that. In the storm intensity really increased. Now, I still have to complete my research, but my preliminary research indicates that it went from a category 1 to a category 4 storm within 45 minutes of Joe Biden speaking at the UN and calling for a two-state solution in the Middle East, dividing the land. And I will tell you, having friends and some family that are down there, Pam has a second cousin who's mayor of a town in Western North Carolina. It's devastating. My understanding is they got about 2 feet of rain. And in the mountains, that leads to torrents and flash flooding of an epic proportion. I'm talking to some friends this morning. They don't expect Asheville, North Carolina, which is considered to be one of the best spots to live in the United States, to have water for months. And the businesses won't open without a water system. The roads will be closed. The North Carolina website says, consider all roads closed in Western North Carolina. Don't even go. And they're having trouble. And now there are reports. There are a lot of people. There are a lot more people dead than they've said so far. Part of it is because they're still in the first phase of a rescue operation, is try to save people who might be alive. And people have said they've gone past places and seen bodies stacked up in where these flash floods went through. The stench is overwhelming, but the emergency personnel say we're still trying to find people alive. Those dead people can wait. And that's a kind of a cold, cruel, harsh reality, but that's the way it is. They had massive floods in Europe last week. I'm looking here, I'm seeing an article from Al Arabiya where the Denmark foreign minister is saying, if Israel won't accept a two-state solution, we need to send military in to force it.
Oh, yeah.
So I would say, if people think the Bible's not relevant and Bible prophecy is not relevant, I think you're silly. And there's going to be a lot of people saying, oh, no, that's not what's going to happen. That's not going to happen. That was all fulfilled before. Okay. So how many more of these things need to pile up before you're going to maybe reconsider your position on supersessionism, or that Israel has absolutely no relevance? And then you get the usual remark, Mark, and you've heard it. Well, they don't believe in the Messiah. They rejected Jesus, so they're getting, and they can't be relevant. But, Derek, right? Derek Gilbert.
Yep.
So he did a podcast the other day. It's at Gilbert House with an Iranian guy, and it was very insightful. And I don't agree with everything that Derek says, but I found this to be very insightful. And he said, we're warned about deception and false Christ in the last days, but we're not warned about a false Israel. And how do these things unfold if there's not an Israel back in the land in unbelief? They make no sense, but everybody wants to deny that. And this Iranian guy, Ali Sadatan or something like that is his name, made a very interesting point that when the church, under the influence of Greco-Roman thinking, organized the Old Testament, they put what we call the Italian prophet Malachi last, and it ends. Malachi ends with a curse. But the way the Hebrews, Jews, organized their Old Testament, they end with Chronicles, which talks about a blessing of coming back and rebuilding the temple. And it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition that maybe our orientation has been wrong all along, not only because of how we interpret the scriptures, but how the scriptures were organized into our Bibles. I can't say that it's not a very... So I'm still processing that insight, and I'm thinking like, well, that's something I didn't think of before. And I actually think it's correct that it's just the way it is.
It comes down to me where there are certain things, of course, we're holding on to scripture firmly, but there is that element of having an open hand to say, Lord, what are you saying here? And what things are moving? A bit like when we were discussing the other day, when using hands, a lot of people want things linear, but actually, and you talked about this, it's very nuanced. There's stuff piled and piled and piled, a bit like if we imagine a load of cogs, a load of gears, and suddenly a small cog moves and this big gear is turned 180 degrees. It's very layered. Maybe that do some people, sorry, I don't mean to be rude to people, but, and I'm not this huge Bible scholar, I'm saying people want it to be so simple, but maybe it's not as simple as people think. Have I explained that very badly?
No, I think you're exactly right. It is. I think it's very, very complex. It's simple, but it's very complex. And I think your analogy of the gear, two wheels with gear, whatever you call ridges on them, but understand that, these two are connected, and this one and this one and this and this one. So when this one turns, all of these turn a little bit too out here. And so sometimes I think, I don't want to be sacrilegious, but sometimes I think that we think we have it all figured out. And sometimes I think that in baseball terms, American baseball terms, that God is up there throwing cosmic knuckleballs at us that kind of dip and move around based on the atmosphere, and like, so you don't think that's going to work out? Watch this. Yeah. And so I think we need to be humble enough in our conclusions. I don't mind righteous speculation. What I mind is planting the flag and saying this is the way it's going to be, regardless of how all the other things are. So I'm open to a lot of ideas on how this unfolds. And I sort of I call them my baskets. I have so there's a whole bunch of different views about the final Babylon, mystery Babylon of Revelation 17 and 18, and how that unfolds. I think Patrick Wood, who we talked to the other day, is talking about the technocracy type thing that we see permeating everything in the world, the technocrats. And now the term that he used, I don't remember if it came up in our program the other day, but I know Sunday he talked about it at Fellowship Bible Chapel, either in his talk or we did a sort of a little joint thing for 45 minutes at the beginning of my update. He talked about techno-populist. So he would term J.D. Vance, the current senator from the state of Ohio and vice presidential candidate, who I thought did very well in his debate last night against this rather loathsome moronic individual named Tim Walz from Minnesota, the man who thought it was a good idea to put tampons in boys' bathrooms.
Absolutely. And have we got to the bottom of how many trips he has made to China? And then he says he was there at Tiananmen Square, and now he denies that he was there in China on the day. It becomes very confusing, doesn't it, John?
He certainly is. It's sometimes I watch things like him. I watch like Candace Owens, who I used to like. They're like in a mental melt. It's like you're watching somebody having a mental breakdown in slow motion. And you're seeing, I mean, we just went through years of a presidency where the person was like that. And the vice president, somebody put up a editorial cartoon this morning, was Obama saying years ago, I want a vice president who is stupider than I am. And then Biden comes in and says, I want a vice president who's stupider than I am. And then Kamala Harris comes in and says, I want a vice president who's stupider than I am. And so there's sort of this accelerating downward progression there on one side of the politics. But J.D. Vance, back to Patrick Wood, is, I think, accurately described as a techno-populist. He's very populist in his orientation, but he's very tied into this technocracy that's developed, including he's very tight with Peter Thiel, who's one of the leading data harvesters on planet Earth. And so we're sitting here trying to decide who do we vote for. And I think it's easier to determine now who we don't vote for. And so if you're going to vote, you just have to know that it's not going to work out exactly the way there are downsides to everybody.
The thing I want to say, just suddenly jumping back to the damage that's been done in North Carolina, etc., is to remember all that in our prayers, because we've seen the pictures and it is of biblical proportions and it is horrific.
It's apocalyptic. We have friends, they live in that area up in the east of Asheville. There's a series of towns, Bat Cave, Chimney Rock, and Lake Lure. A friend lives in Bat Cave. He had a house around somewhere up there in the mountains. His son and daughter-in-law and their two young children were living there. They didn't hear from them for days. They had to hike 3 miles out, and they posted on their Facebook page yesterday. They finally got back to where they had some kind of internet service. Wow. And I mean, there were places where, like the forge across where the washout occurred, they had ladders that people had set up to allow people to do that. And they're like, the house is gone, their cars are gone, and they don't know where they're going to go. And I see people offering, well, you can come and live with us in Indiana. And they literally walked out with as much as they're going to have for years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Lake Lure, the town of Chimney Rock, was completely washed away. I have friends in Asheville. They're talking about, months and months and months with no water. No businesses are going to open without water. The town, it was an idyllic little mountain town. It's just devastated. I mean, it's something like I've never really think I've seen. And this storm intensified while our president was calling for Israel to be divided. I don't think there's not a direct connection there.
No, and I do agree with you, as much as that may be uncomfortable to say, or for some people to actually listen, and uncomfortable, because you and I have said this maybe off camera, where we think of Senior Bush, wasn't he? I think it was at a meeting in Madrid and they're discussing a 2-state solution. Then suddenly his house in Maine, I believe, is then completely flooded out. There are other examples as well.
There are several hundred of them. But the George W. Bush one in Maine, and what led to a movie called The Perfect Storm, is probably the most obvious one of many.
No, I hear. John, I want to ask you a question before we pivot back. And it's interesting what you were saying about Vance, because people have to remember the connections, all these different relationships. And as we have a prime minister at the moment called Keir Starmer, who I describe as a technocrat, and then I look at the laws and stuff that they're coming out of Europe.
Well, the cover of the Evening Standard that you pointed out to me the other day, the AI generated thing about is England, London is going to be an AI superpower.
Well,
that's clearly a technocrat.
Yeah, let's see how we get on with that one, because just quickly in regard to our election, it's also very interesting, and this applies to you, where our press over here did not hold him to account. There's a big scandal going on. It's going to evolve, and maybe on another day you and I can talk about that. But people watch what is happening in the press over here, where there is all these gifts that he's been taking in regard to buying clothing and using someone else's apartment. It ties up to what Patrick says, where people are trying, what is the truth? It's this deliberate confusion, and it has been hidden. John, I've asked you this question off air in regard to going back to the appalling events of October the 7th and what we've seen go on over the last year, because we're approaching the anniversary of those awful events. Have you seen anyone change their mind in regard to Israel? I suppose the easiest thing to say in regard to the Christian world, but of course it's applying way outside that, who then would have said, well, I'm into replacement theology, but now I'm not into replacement theology. I understand the God of the Bible, the God of Israel. Has anyone moved what we would say in regard to our opinion, our worldview?
So within the church, defining it as the evangelical church, I'm not aware of anyone who's moved towards what I would call a pro-Israel or Christian Zionist position. The movement seems to have all been the opposite direction, away from Israel, supporting Israel. And in fact, it's not just they're not supporting Israel, they are attacking Israel with a vengeance that I don't even think they attack the devil with. Now I have seen some in Arab and Muslim cultures who have moved towards supporting Israel. But in the Christian community, and there may be some that are doing it that I don't know about, I think that I've not seen it go that way. The one exception I can think of, there are some guys that I would put in sort of the evangelical megachurch movement that would sort of been tied into the Rick Warren model, the what was that guy's name that he worked with? The Peter Drucker, marketing model that seemed to have moved towards talking about Bible prophecy. I'm thinking of Ed Young Jr. at Grapevine Church down in Dallas area. I think it's called Fellowship Community Church or something like that. Big mega church, like 15, 20,000 people. He's been having prophecy conferences. I also saw recently that Max Lucado, who I doubt really talked about Bible prophecy at all, is now doing series on Bible prophecy. So I have to acknowledge that. Now, we can talk about whether we still have issues with those guys on some things, but I'm just sort of on this particular subject, I've seen a change there. But I've not seen a big change throughout the evangelical church. In fact, it's been mostly the opposite direction.
Within the church and outside the church in regard to people commentating on events.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose, sadly, we would then have to include people like Candace Owen, and we would have to include people like Tucker Carlson. Is that a fair point?
It's more than a fair point. Tucker had on this guy named Daryl Scott, who came in and Hitler it was sort of it was sort of an accident that the Holocaust happened. And Tucker describes him as the best historian in America, which is that he would do that indicates that there's a much bigger agenda behind what Tucker Carlson is doing. But then again, Mark, I see the Republican National Convention when they nominate Trump and for president and JD Vance for vice president. And there they are all over the place working together. It's shocking to me. And somebody asked JD Vance the other day, hey, what about Tucker Carlson and his view on this? And he just ignored the question. So that's concerning to me. So we have to be honest that this is a concerning issue. And look, JD Vance is my senator one of my senators from Ohio. Mm. And by the way, the other guy is a lunatic that grew up in the same town that my wife did, and he's always been sort of insane leftist, I guess is what I would call him.
Is that DeWine?
No, that's Sherrod Brown. DeWine was one of the senators from Ohio. I think he got beat by DeWine, to be honest, or not by Sherrod Brown. And so he came back in and he did a couple terms as the Attorney General of Ohio, then moved up into the governorship. So he'll be finishing up his 8 years as governor in a couple of years. He's been, from my view, he's been a major disappointment. Let's just put it that way. And he's from small college, Christian college town, Cedarville, Ohio, where Cedarville University is, a Baptist school. I don't know. He's been a disappointment. So, it's one of these things you got to hold your nose and vote. But, the culture's changing. In the United States, we had the Supreme Court ruling overturning Roe versus Wade after 50 years. But a lot of people thought, okay, well, now we're okay. Well, no, we're not, because now the pro-abortion side of things has really taken that to heart. They think it's a winning issue for them politically. And here in my county, which is a very conservative, has always been historically one of the harbingers of how conservatives are doing across the country. This is like the bellwether. In our county, Ohio had a couple things on the ballot last year. One was sort of, I would think, pro-life, and then the other one was pro-abortion. The pro-life thing lost in our county, and the pro-abortion thing won by a 2-to-1 margin in my county, a conservative red county. But, that's because we're facing 50 years of indoctrination that Roe versus Wade is a good thing. And so, those things, it's sort of like a big battleship or aircraft carrier. You don't come into port and then turn it. You turn it before you come into port, because it takes a long time to get it to change direction and move the right way.
No, I totally understand that. I totally get it. And like over here, we had our Foreign Secretary David Lammy stand up a few weeks ago and say we will not be selling. Giving license to sell certain parts to Israel in regard to supporting them for whatever parts these are in regard to munitions, etc., within the military. Stands up and says that, and then last night, you've got Keir Starmer standing up and saying, well, we stand with Israel, and what Iran do is despicable. And then suddenly I've seen Biden saying we're standing with Israel. These people seem to be speaking out of both sides of their mouth. This isn't the first time we have said this, but what are the optics? I mean, you've just talked about JD Vance. I watched some of that with Tim Wolf. What are the optics? How are they playing out on your side at the moment? Because suddenly Biden, as I said, Biden's going, we stand with Israel.
You mean the person you think was Biden said that?
I can't possibly comment on that, or what studio they're actually saying it, or whether it is real. But fair comment.
I think Joe Biden is he's always been a puppet. So years ago, I think I misspoke one Sunday when I was talking about the Biden administration, and I called it the O'Biden administration. Mm. And that's probably because that's who I thought really was running things behind the scenes. And I think that that's clearly true. So this was the third Obama administration that we've just been going through. Mark, there are so many things on the political level in the United States that are troubling. I know you've examined some of the things associated with a recent election there in much more detail than I have. The lawfare that's taking place. And then I believe Tim Walz last night at the vice presidential debate said, we're concerned that Trump will imprison his political opponents. It's been like 100% the other way. And these morons, I don't know how else to describe them. I apologize to all the morons in the world if I'm insulting them, but associating the mainstream media with you. But good grief, they don't understand. I don't know. Romans 1 has a progression, and this progression is eventually you get involved in this, and it starts with some sexual license and issues there, and you eventually get to where you lose the ability to reason. And I think, and to those of us who are blessed, who have been called by God, I think we look at it and we can only describe it as madness. But maybe the more correct way is to describe it as the judgment of God actually being evident in these people.
The verses that come to mind is, I'll hand you over to a delusion.
Mm-hmm.
I've thought about this. I think that could be what we're seeing.
Well, that verse in 2 Thessalonians 2 that I think that they'll believe the lie. There's an ultimate lie that they believe, okay? Mm-hmm. But what's the progression to get to believe that really big lie? Mm-hmm. That the Antichrist is a substitute for Jesus. It's a progression. And then there's an acceleration convergence thing about that aspect. And so how do you build the foundation for people to accept this demonic person as a substitute for Christ? How do you get to that point? And I just think we look around and we see it happening on many scales. And by the way, we also see it on the right too, with people who ascribe things to Donald Trump or other people that are way beyond, I hope they're way beyond what he thinks he's entitled to. But they turn him into a messianic figure as well. And that's as troubling to me as it is the crazy people on the left of the ledger.
No, and I agree with you, and I hear you very, very, very loudly on that.
I think we all need to guard our hearts in this day and age as we go forward. I mean, if you're not grounded in the Word of God, you're going to open yourself up to a lot of false, deceptive stuff. So stay grounded in God's Word.
And it's really interesting because some of the people that you mentioned, Max Lucado, the other name, where these people are now teaching biblical, they're looking at Bible prophecy. I mean, you and I would clearly accept, I think, is a subject that I've never heard, not that I'm a fan, but I think Rick Warren would never go near. And just for the record, he's now the sort of honorary chancellor of Spurgeon's College in South London. So I'll just leave that thought out there. But
I think Rick is at the fourth Lausanne convention last week, talking about, I don't know, whatever he talks about. So I've been to his church. I actually went to his church once with Bill Caning. We were down spending the day with him and his wife Claudia before she passed away, and we went over to his church that night, and Rick gave a message, and Bill and I were making little tick marks on a sheet of paper. So I knew what he was doing. He was looking every time Rick cited a passage, we put one tick mark here, and then how many different versions did we use? We put a tick mark below that, and we both came up with the same number. He had 14 Bible passages, but 9 different Bible versions that he used in his sermon or talk that night. Because it wasn't he wanted to tell us what the scripture said. He wanted to tell us what he thought and then make us think that, oh, all these scriptures supported him.
I hear. And I think that is the next challenge. If people start that, I know this area is very dangerous place to go, but let's just say it. When we're suddenly realize certain people are picking up the subject of Bible prophecy, they may have not looked at that before. They're introducing that to the church, and then it's the importance of discernment that people need to go back to the scripture and be like that Berean. So as you said the other day, it is, and Patrick, it is discernment. It is discernment that we are so needing.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I don't know if this came up in our talk with Patrick, but I know you had gone to Burning Man with Carl and some of our other friends, and to evangelize people, which I'm fully on board with. Why not go into the belly of the beast, so to speak? But Peter Thiel and some of these technocrats, Sam Altman and stuff, they're all burners. They want, and when you look at it, you sort of look at the symbolic Burning Man overlay. What's underneath that is they want to burn down the image of God, man being made in the image of God.
Absolutely. And then everybody think about the relationships again that they have politically, and the same is over here. Exactly the same over here, but in a different way, partly because the fact that we're far more down the socialist road. But what you've just absolutely a Burning Man. And the other thing is, it's interesting. Yes, we had some incredible conversations there, and those conversations are still ongoing because there's email contact with some people, which is fantastic. But also it's building those relationships, and it is relational to then sit down and have that discussion. And I was reminded today by one of the team wonderful to hear from, George phoned me up and talked about a conversation that he had then had as everyone was beginning to exit. Burning Man had finished on the Sunday night. He and Ginny, I think, left by Tuesday, but they were having this incredible conversation with some of our neighbors there, and the neighbors going, well, do you believe in God? Do you believe in aliens? Do you believe in Bigfoot? The fact that people were asking these questions, and thank you for what you said, John, because they are the places we should be. I don't understand why there are only 8 of us and there's only 11 of us at the Parliament of World Religions last year. Sorry, right. I think, where is everybody?
Well, I guess sometimes people think that they'll be contaminated if they allow themselves to hear what the other people are saying. So that's why you got to be grounded in the word. Look, I sort of follow as I prepare my thing. I've been accused of just, being swayed by other people's propaganda, which I consider to be a pretty nasty insult. But I sort of follow, there was a conservative commentator here in the United States, Cal Thomas. I think Cal's still alive, by the way. And he said that he got up every morning and he read the Bible because he wanted to be on board with God's plan. And then he read the New York Times and Washington Post because he wanted to find out what the other side was planning and doing. And so that's sort of how I do it. I think if you're grounded in your faith, you can look at that. Now, there's some things you should avoid, obviously, but their geopolitical commentary, I think, is fair game to read and listen to. But I'm just telling you, man, we are so it's crazy. It's just crazy we're seeing.
It's coming at us thick and fast. And the other thing I will quickly say is that I'm not saying that everyone should be going to Burning Man. I'm not called to do that. I'm not saying everyone should go to the Parliament of World Religions. But as you've just said, John, about Cal saying this, I'm then going to listen to the New York Times and New York Post to find out what the enemy's doing. I think absolutely brilliant. We've got scripture. We've got to be aware, and we can't just be in a bubble. But I hear you, John. I'm in the last minute, and you know what? We haven't even got to a subject that I want to talk about with you. And I think we're going to have to do this again very soon and talk about, because I want to go in the direction of the British royal family. Look at King Charles now, Prince Charles in the past, what he was up to. And you brought up the subject of Terra Carta, which is then based on the Magna Carta, and then Astra Carta, e.g. Charles is gone, we're now going to leave the earth, and now I need to go in space and muck that up. So I think, John, I just want to thank you for your time, and I need to book you where we can sit down and go into Terra Carta and go into Astra Carta.
Sure.
This is really, really important. John, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And I'll play us out, and then I'll say goodbye on the other side. But thank you so much for your time today, sir.
Always. Thanks, Mark.